Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. This is Ukraine War news. No, it's not. It's Ukraine War update extra video giving you extra tidbits and nuggets to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. I have no idea what I'm doing or saying, really, do I? Okay, so I'm going to actually start where I was going to end because actually this might take quite a long time and it might indeed take up the whole video. This is a really big topic, and it's one that I've been involved with commenters on my thread. Daniel Corrigan I was speaking to yesterday about this. Great commenter on the thread. We may have our political disagreements, but I love the fact that people with different political persuasions still kind of listen to what I say and are open to different points of view, and so that's absolutely fantastic. And we're talking about is the money that the US is spending for the defense kind of worth it? Is it too much? Are they not spending money on other things as a result? So on and so forth. And this is one of these massive questions. And you get these headline figures of how much money is spent on all this equipment. And there's a lot to say about that. And I will repeat myself a little bit here, but those numbers are often very misleading. First of all, virtually all of that money stays in Ukraine, or vast proportion of that money, stays in the US, which is to say that if the US are spending all this money on all this equipment, they have a really, really strong military industrial complex, and they make pretty much all their stuff indigenously. So they say, right, we're going to give all this equipment to Ukraine. Now, either that is drawdown, that's old equipment sitting in warehouses they're going to get rid of, in which case that's already been bought. So they might put a value on that, but actually they are not paying that. In fact, they're not storing it anymore. The only cost is the transportation costs. So they're going to say, right, we're going to give all this equipment to Ukraine. That's actually costing nothing. It's saving them money in some respects. Then the question is, okay, they're going to replace that. If it's equipment they're going to replace, then okay, they're going to have to buy the equipment to replace that equipment. In which case, they are going to manufacture that. They're going to put orders in. Where's that being made? In the US. So that equipment is then being made in the US, which stimulates the economy, and that money, there's money multipliers. So you spend money in your own economy, that will then, you're putting money in. So say an employer, I mean, it gets a little bit funky when you talk about massive corporations. If you're talking about someone that's now got a job and is working even harder, or there are more jobs being created because they're building these more, Raytheon's building more stuff. And you're saying, right, that $100 that Jim Smith has earned in wherever in the US, he then takes that $100 and he goes and spends that in his local economy. That goes into the local food shop and the local hardware store and whatever, and then so $100 actually multiplies, and $100 becomes like $1,000 as that money goes into different people's pocket, and it's a kind of money multiplier. This is why you should always buy local, because actually buying local is more of a money multiplier than going to a big, supermarket and so on and so forth. Anyway, whatever, that's a whole other economic thing. But the idea here is that if the US is spending a load of money manufacturing stuff to send to Ukraine, then that money is going into the US economy and will be multiplied and will be a stimulus for the US economy. That's a good thing. That's how the New Deal worked, kind of post-war. It's like, okay, let's reconstruct the US with a load of like national projects, and loads of people got jobs and money, and that's one way of stimulating the economy. Most of their stuff is going to be made by US corporations, and occasionally, they will be spending money to get hold of stuff like old Soviet era ammunition and this and that can't be made in the US, or can't quickly be made in the US. So yes, they'll be going out and doing that, but then you can bet there'll be sweeteners like, okay, if we buy this off you, then you do this for us. And there's all sorts of international shenanigans going on that will, I think, ultimately be to the benefit of the US in terms of influence, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, all of these sorts of things are going on. Those headline figures aren't always prima facie what you think they are on the face of it, right? And they require a little bit of delving. And so that massive amount of money isn't actually that massive amount of money. It might not even be near that amount of money. And that money is being thrown predominantly into the US economy. And if it isn't, then there'll be other things attached to it. And so there's lots of stuff to think about here. So I've had these conversations on my previous videos, and here's someone yesterday, Pyotr Alexievich. I hope you pronounce that correctly. Jonathan, don't be afraid to explain to my fellow Americans that we are in fact saving money. Those HIMARS, if they were retrofitted at all, it was last done in 1993. Those Abrams A1S in mothballs for a minimum of 25 years, not our latest and greatest. The cost of transferring those assets and many others like them is far less than decommissioning them. And that's the idea, right? Actually, if we can give them away, then we don't have to take them apart and spend money taking them apart. This is true for virtually every drawdown. Then the other thing to mention that I didn't quite mention before is these are decisions that get made outside of war as well. It's like, right, we are going to replace the Avengers with these types of strikers that do the same job, but they're better. Right, that's what we're going to do. Ukraine war hasn't. We decided that before the Ukraine war. Ukraine war comes along, we're going to replace these Avengers. Okay. Well, we might as well give them to Ukraine. Right. We're giving $50 million worth of Avengers to Ukraine. It's like people think, oh, they've taken $50 million out of the US bank, like big national bank, federal bank, and like $50 million and throw that to Ukraine. Here's some Avengers. That's not how it works. Like, we were going to replace that. It's been budgeted for. So we are going to give these Avengers to Ukraine, get these strikers in, which are being bought, manufactured here in the US. And that was decided that was going to happen anyway. But we're going to put a price tag of $50 million on that. And everyone thinks, oh, the US has spent $50 million. And it hasn't. That was always going to happen. In fact, arguably, they've saved money. So this is the point. This is true for virtually every drawdown. And then, of course, is not only drawdown. They are getting stuff that, okay, HIMARS rockets, we need loads of those, blah, 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 blah. But here's the benefit, right? You tell me how many HIMARS are now being sold as a result of the war in Ukraine. So the US government are saying, okay, we're going to spend X million dollars on HIMARS rockets and HIMARS machines, send them to Ukraine. Brilliant. Okay, that's cost the US government whatever money. And now it turns out that every Tom, Dick, and Harry around the world wants HIMARS. So the company are getting all these requests. They've got a waiting list. They're making them 24/7. And those are coming in. That's coming in back in tax dollars. Or there's some arrangement with the US where actually the ones they give them to Ukraine are cheap because actually it's generating whatever the deals they do. Like, this isn't just money going to Ukraine. This is some stuff going to Ukraine and loads of financial things going on to the benefit of the US in terms of increased tax dollars that you can then spend on welfare or building walls or whatever you want to do with that, right? So it's not a zero-sum game necessarily here. It's not like we are going to take money out of the US, and because we've taken it out of the US and plonked it in Ukraine, suddenly we can't build schools in the US and we can't do whatever it is we wanted to do. No, it's not. This is to do with the military budgets, which are huge anyway, and there's money swirling around, and it's not as simple as that. Anyway, I interrupted myself. Then there's the reality of global economic damage caused by Russia's continued existence, ensuring the end of the existence will pay dividends for hundreds of years, says this person. Right, we're going to have a little look into this. Now, first of all, no, I'll come to that in a second, actually. No, we'll go first to something written in January this year. 4 reasons why supporting Ukraine is a good investment from the Wilson Center, Focus Ukraine blog. So what they say here is the aid provided too much? To start, let's get some clarity concerning the amount under discussion. And of course, this is a couple of months old now. 3 months old. According to the data made public by the Department of the Treasury and Bureau of Fiscal Studies, US government spending in 2022 reached about 6.27 trillion. So that's US government spending as a whole, of which national defense spending accounted for 767 billion, or about 12%. So 12% of their spending was spent on national defense. According to a recent briefing on military assistance to Ukraine published by the UK House of Commons Library, the largest line item was 18.6 billion spent on military assistance for Ukraine since February 2022, or about 2.5% of US defense spending. It's really important that we get these massive numbers in perspective. The US has a freaking huge economy, with a massive amount of money swirling around and a lot of tax revenue, which I always think it's odd that people argue that IRS should be cut. It's like, dudes, if you want to get more tax revenue in from people like Amazon, then you probably need more IRS employees. Anyway, that's a whole other debate. Right. The idea is perspective here. Don't get carried away with those big numbers and think, well, God, I don't earn that much. That's a massive number. Yeah, it's a massive number out of a really, really, really massive number. So, insofar as significant part of this figure represents funds absorbed by the military industry in the United States and its allies, the amount going directly to Ukraine is relatively minor. I mean, really, I could end the talk here, right? But I will go on, especially if one considers regional security is in the United States' interests in the face of growing uncertainty over the US-China relationship. More to say on that later. Right. So why is funding for Ukraine important? And this is all from a US point of view, but you can take elements of this and apply it to your own nation, and it will still be relevant, right? So one, to avoid a global war. You know, that's money well spent. I reckon that's probably a good idea. Now you could say, well, it's getting involved in a global war, but actually, if you were to allow, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, the cost benefit of allowing Russia to take over Ukraine, then actually you look 50 years down the line, yeah, things won't look so good. You got to nip these things in the bud. And there's a lot to talk about each of these arguments, and I won't go into all the details in this piece because there's many more sources I'm going to rely on as well. To strengthen the United States' international position, right, I'm sorry to let you guys know this in the US who might feel uncomfortable about this, but you've had an interesting up and down with how the rest of the world perceives you in the last 20 years. Okay. Just from my, and I know I'm politically not aligned with the Republicans in the US, but when Bush was in charge, he was a bit of a laughing stock. Like all our comedy programs would take the mickey out of Bush. And it was like he was, now I'm not talking about his politics necessarily, but like in terms of international standing and what the community outside of the US thought of America, you kind of get represented by your president. Obama came along and loads of the world fell in love with Obama. Like you may hate him, you may be a dyed-in-the-wool GOP supporter, but you need to understand how the rest of the world viewed you. And I am speaking in generalities because there'll be a lot of people in the rest of the world who didn't like Obama, right, and who preferred, Bush or whatever. But in generalities, and you can look at the data for. In fact, I'm going to find that data. So again, put aside, if you're American, put aside what you believe about how great you are and how great each of your leaders were. This is about what the rest of the world perceives of the US in terms of hard data. So don't shoot the messenger. This is a hard data. So Pew Research Center, international public opinion in the US remains positive after an all-time low ratings in many countries in 2020 and a sharp recovery in 2021. Ratings of the US remain high this year, a median of 61% across 17 countries surveyed with a favorable view of the US, while only 35% have an unfavorable view. So on and so forth. So in other words, there's been a bit of a bounce back. Indeed, the Business Insider says global approval of the US has shot up 15 points during Biden's first year after crashing under Trump. A new polling finds. So what does it say? Median approval of US leadership shot up 15 percentage points, according to the latest edition of Gallup's World Poll. So that's different from Pew Research Center. The bump takes America roughly back to the Obama era norm of approval in the 45% range compared to 30% during Trump's final year in office. Biden even tied Obama's 49% record high in August 2021 before his US rating slipped in the second half of the year amid the administration's chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, although Gallup cautions it can't specifically say the withdrawal caused that decline. And then here we look at approvals of individual presidents. And this is so respecting him. So Clinton in the 40s, then we went George W. Bush in the 40s up to 75 and 60s and down, and then ended up really quite low towards the end of his tenure. But in 2002, George W. Bush, and that would be the rally around a flag bounce from the 9/11, very famous. You get it's called rally around a flag. You get a bounce in terms of your popularity when you are perceived to be really strong on external threats. This has been accounted for many times around the world. It happened with Margaret Thatcher in 1979. In fact, she was probably not going to get back in, and then we had the Falklands War against Argentina, and her popularity, rocketed, and she got re-elected and didn't look back. So that's really important. But so that's just to explain that spike there, and then that sort of came back down, and then George W. Bush ended in the low 20s. Then Barack Obama came along, started in 67, then kicked around the 50s for most of the time, and then ended on 45, had a bit of a dip just before the end, but ended on 45. And we had Trump taking over. It started in the 20s, stayed there, and then went up a little bit in 2020 to 37. And then Joe Biden started 58%, and then, as it mentions, dropped, as they think that's to do with Afghanistan dropping. But then actually that's 2023 now, so we shall see. What happens there. That's February 2023. No, 17th of January. Sorry, you Americans do your dates in the wrong order, of course, or something. I don't know. Anyway, whatever. So you can see that there has been this up and down, and the idea is that this war not this war, America's position in supporting Ukraine very robustly doesn't just help Ukraine, doesn't have this impact and that impact in terms of Ukraine, but in terms of the US is standing in the world amongst its global partners. Now, you might see places like China, Brazil, maybe thinking the US ain't so cool because they're slightly more aligned with Russia. So there will be some interesting statistics in certain countries for sure. But international position is really important to improve the image of the United States. That's again the same kind of idea, and so on and so forth. So that's what the Wilson Center said. Just going to go to this piece by Pointer. US spending in Afghanistan dwarfs aid to Ukraine. And there's an Instagram video by someone recently that made really incorrect claims about Afghanistan expenditure being far lower than Ukraine. And it depends how you cut these things up, but it was wrong basically. But one widely cited estimate shows the US spent around 2.3 trillion in 2 decades in Afghanistan from fiscal year 2001 to 2022. That's from the Costs of War project by researchers at Brown University's Wilson Institute for International and Public Affairs. That's 2.189 trillion more than the 101.11 billion in aid given to Ukraine. Now, that includes things like veterans bills and things like that. So if you're just talking about arms, then it's a lot less. I think there's some estimates around 800, 900 billion, but that's not actually the cost of wars. The thing is, if you're taking troops to Afghanistan and putting those troops in Afghanistan, then the cost of that war is the treatment you have to give them for PTSD, sorry, letters, and the cost of the increase in veterans pensions and things with people who have been fighting, so on and so forth. These costs then balloon to this larger 2.2 trillion. But of course, most of those costs involved in that kind of understanding of the war in Afghanistan won't be the case for the US in Ukraine, because there are no troops in Ukraine. It's just literally giving them stuff that they need to fight their own war. That is for the benefit of the rest of the world who are aligned with them. So let's now go to the CSIS. This is the Center for Strategic and International Studies. This is a later one by Anthony Cordesman. This is from February 2023, Saving by Spending, the True Value and Cost Effectiveness of US Aid to Ukraine. He starts with Oscar Wilde is rarely quoted as an expert on strategy, warfare, and international relations, but one of his more famous quips is all too relevant to some of the efforts to reduce US assistance to Ukraine. In one of his plays, Wilde has a key character state in response to a question of who is a fool, that he is, quote, a man who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. Some critics of US aid to Ukraine, including some in Congress, meet this definition of a fool all too well. The story is very different, however, when criticism focuses on cost alone. So, sorry, I missed a bit here. But the end result not only chooses price over values like freedom and democracy, it ignores the fact that while the rising number of billions the United States is spending on aid to Ukraine keeps growing, the cost of aid to Ukraine is almost certain to remain comparatively low when compared to the total cost of US security. Is a vital investment in deterring future Russian and Chinese aggression and is likely to save the US substantial amounts of national security spending in the future. So this is an investment as much as it is doing X, Y, and Z else, right? It is an investment that will pay dividends down the line. The US national defense budget is now projected to cost $827 billion in financial year 2023, and the Department of Defense portion alone is $802.4 billion. The cost of US national intelligence is $67.1 billion, and the military intelligence budget adds $26.6 billion more. This, however, is only part of the real price tag. Somewhat strangely, the president never submits an estimate of the total cost of national security. Congress never ever reviews it, and the media never reports on it. Nevertheless, the real cost of US national security spending is far higher. That's a really important point, is there's a lot of money that is spent on national security. It's never questioned. You don't really know how much is spent. A bit of a budget black hole. No one talks about it. So the financial year 2023 budget of the Veterans Administration, whose functions are a critical part of funding all volunteer forces, is a truly massive $301.4 billion. That's a veterans bill, and of course, this kind of activity is not going to affect that kind of that line of the budget. This means that the price of the actual cash flow of aid to Ukraine must be compared to the total national security budget of over 1.2 trillion. And by that standard, the price tag. So that's saying that, yeah, you're going to be spending 800 on whatever billion on the national defense, but actually you probably need to include 300 billion Veterans Administration, because that is part of your national defense budget. So yeah. So if it's more like 1.2 trillion plus, and by that standard, the price tag is limited. According to press reports, Congress had approved some 113 billion in aid by the end of 2022, which included 47.3 billion of emergency funding to provide humanitarian, military, and economic assistance to Ukraine. And bear in mind, when the economic assistance is provided, you can bet there are strings attached. Again, it's an investment going forward. What part will US corporations and companies and organizations play in Ukraine going forward? There's no such thing as a free lunch. Sadly, I mean, there will be strings attached. So the US will have some say in what goes on going forward with Ukraine, or get some benefit from the money that they are pumping in, economically speaking. So that assistance to Ukraine, and another 65.8 billion that have been approved in 3 other emergency funding packages. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget estimates that the 3/5, 67 billion, were allocated to defence needs, 46 billion to non-defence concerns that provide the civil support the Ukrainians need to survive Russian attacks and keep fighting, such as general Ukrainian government aid, economic support, and aid for the refugee settlement, pending where the basic human values is protecting a free people, may be far more important than a price tag. That's a long sentence. But moreover, these totals are the current totals for all current and future funding now authorised, and not for the money actually spent to date. Now, this is one of the most important points of what I'm going to say. So when you hear about this money, I've already explained to you how don't trust those figures in terms of it's not money going from the US and being thrown into Ukraine. All the stuff I've already said. Don't need to repeat that. But it's also money not spent now, but quite often when you say we're spending 60 billion quid on X, right? It turns out that 60 billion quid is 10 billion quid this year, 20 billion quid the year after, and 30 billion quid the year after that. And actually, it's 3 years worth of budget or spending thrown into this headline figure. So this is what it says here. Not all of this money was spent in financial year 2022 or will be spent in 2023. The Congressional Budget Office estimated that 6.6 billion of the 113 billion was spent in 2022. another 37.7 billion will be spent in financial year 2023, and it estimated more than half of the approved funds will be spent by the end of 2024, and more than 3/4 by the end of 2026. So that's even by 2026, a quarter of that money that's supposedly been spent this year, this is 2022, won't have even been spent by the end of 2026. So you need to understand that these figures are much more nuanced than many reporters are giving them credit for being. The US is already pledging more, but the total annual burden to the US national budget is determined by actual cash flow in a given year, not the total size of the pledge. This means that any challenge to continued aid must fully consider the true value of the price of continuing annual aid. Not only are current pledges and actual cash flow a fraction of the total annual cost of national security, but they also put immense pressure on Russia and raise its costs far more than the United States spends as it actually has to fight a war. So that's what he says there, and that was this year. And we go back to a behemoth piece the same guy wrote for the CSIS with his very long sentences back in 20. In fact, my mouse is not working. United States aid to Ukraine, an investment whose benefits greatly exceed its costs, back in 2022, November. So this is November 2022, but the points remain salient. This is Anthony Cordesman again for the CSIS. Okay. I've picked out again a few bits and pieces. Goodness me, I mean, I'm going straight. I'm already like a third of the way down. It's a massive article, so just popping into a few bits. This does not mean there are no limits to what the US can and should do. The US cannot police or heal the world or provide Ukraine with unlimited support. The US cannot fund every need or allocate funds without regard to its own national interests. It must allocate its limited aid funds and efforts according to their strategic value to the US and how effectively the money will be used. But it must also consider the cost of not providing the aid. So it's the opportunity cost being evaluated here, and the probable end result and the grand strategic benefits of continuing to provide such aid. The US must exercise strategic triage. It must spend where this is clearly in its national interest, and Ukraine is a key case in point. US aid to Ukraine is still probably the most cost-effective investment the US and its strategic partners have recently made in national security, and an investment whose benefits will still outweigh its costs. So maintaining and increasing trust in US leadership and the confidence of strategic partners and allies. In contrast, if the US had not provided an initial flood of aid to Ukraine, it continues later, and then continued to provide additional aid in response to Russian escalation, this would probably have created a Europe that lost much of its confidence in US guarantees and extended deterrence. It would have been a world where economic sanctions against Russia and cuts in Russian gas exports would not have been initiated or sustained. It is doubtful that Sweden and Finland would have applied to join the weak and indecisive NATO. Quite possibly, Russia would have acted on other ambitions, like putting new levels of pressure on the Baltic states, exploiting its enclave in Kaliningrad, and taking full military control of Belarus and Moldova. Failing to provide aid would have sent a message to nations in Asia and the Middle East that they could not count on US aid. In short, any US failure to provide massive continuing aid after the Russian invasion began would have been the equivalent of a proxy war that the US had decisively lost in spite of all its military strength. Right. We are already seeing the breakdown of these Caucasus to the south of Russia. Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan are all getting a bit jittery. The power that used to infiltrate these countries is now waning. Russia is in trouble. And this is all as a result of continued support that the US and its allies are providing to Ukraine to fight this war. Russia is unable to stamp its authority on the Baltic states. In fact, the Baltic states and Poland have really stood up to say no. Would they have done that if the US hadn't supported the Ukrainians at all? No. You've got an absolutely changed international dynamic where the EU, NATO, allies of Ukraine have coalesced around the US, right, in supporting that kind of hegemony rather than BRICS and the Russia-China. So this has an effect. China is looking on understanding that the US is coming together with its allies, and that's a big worry. And so China has actually kowtowed in a sense, to the rest of the world, and not overtly supported Russia. It might try and get away with doing as much as it can, but it is treading a very fine line here, and really doing a lot more looking on than getting involved. And that is precisely because the US has got so involved here. In practical terms, however, the aid the US and allied nations have provided to Ukraine, coupled to the sanctions and diplomatic pressure they have put on Russia's economy, have imposed immense costs on a Russia that can scarcely afford the war it now has had to fight. Russia was scarcely an economic or resource-rich military superpower before the war began. And it claimed it was, but actually it's far more of a paper bear. And the US and its allies could draw upon far larger economic resources. Accordingly, while US aid to Ukraine has scarcely been cheap, US spending has been at token levels compared to the economic burden that the cost of the Ukraine war and economic sanctions have placed on Russia. And in a sense, this is a zero-sum game, which is like, if you're talking about power structures going on in the world, and you've got Russia and China and US and EU, let's say, I'm simplifying hugely. If Russia is screwed, then that is to the benefit of the others, partially also to the benefit of China, I would argue. But yes. So once aid spending is put in the context of American economic strength and leverage, it allows the US to exert immense strategic leverage on Russia at a minimal cost to the US, and in ways that US spending on military forces vital to its US security cannot match. I mean, they are able to achieve things in terms of international geopolitical power. The US are able to achieve things that they never would have dreamed of achieving had Russia not invaded Ukraine. This would have all had to have been done in terms of like a big game of geopolitical chess and economic trade and this and that. Actually, it's far easier to obtain those objectives, those outcomes, given that Russia's gone to war. It sounds an odd thing to say, but that's the reality. Major military and NATO alliance benefits. So the US investment in aid to Ukraine and Ukrainian military success has had many other grand strategic benefits. So Ukraine's military successes have exposed Russia's many military weaknesses, gave the US and NATO a priceless insight into Russia's limits and vulnerabilities, led Sweden and Finland to apply to join NATO, and led many NATO states, including key cases Germany, to announce plans to revitalize their forces in ways where a decade of NATO efforts to persuade them to spend 2% of their GDP on defense failed to accomplish. Another very long sentence. Moreover, the US support of Ukraine did more than show NATO and other partners that alliances can really work. It provided priceless practical military and diplomatic experience in improving the structure of the NATO alliance and in showing the US how to cooperate with partners in modern warfare versus counterterrorism and wars like Afghanistan. As many of Russia's failures in the Ukraine war show, this kind of practical experience is critical in modernizing combat forces and the entire military structure of the US and allied forces, and the Russians' lack of such experience was critical reason for many of its defeats. Nothing else the US could have done or spent defense and aid funds upon could have been as productive in ensuring the security of the US against one of the two major powers that could threaten the US, as well as its partners and allies. Nothing the US can do in the future will be as productive in showing allies and partners that collective efforts to defend can secure Europe and the Atlantic and help rebuild strategic confidence and trust in the US. Massively important there. Like, there's no other way they could have achieved actually really beneficial outcomes to the US in terms of both soft power, talking about like how popular they are and whatnot, and also just hard power. The US, this will pay dividends for the US. I'm absolutely certain. Quite from the moral and ethical nature of abandoning a democracy of more than 43 million people who did nothing to provoke a Russian attack, it's hard to believe that any current strategic partner or ally would then fully trust the US. The result would sharply, so if they hadn't done it, this is the opportunity cost of not getting involved. The result would sharply undermine NATO, and for the occasional European rhetoric about a European defence of Europe, there is no indication that Europe can actually achieve that level of unity and military strength and effectiveness required without dependence on the US and trust in its willing to aid Europe in war. Other European allies like Britain and allies in other regions like in Asia and the Middle East might continue to try to work with the US, but no partner nation could be expected to fully rely on the US. The countries, this again, if they hadn't have done this, if they hadn't supported someone in need who they'd given security guarantees to previously, they hadn't gone to support them, then everyone else looks at America and go, well, I don't really trust you anymore. The countries in the forward areas near the Russian border would have become far more vulnerable to Russian pressure, and vulnerable states far more reluctant to resist Chinese pressure. Somewhat ironically, the US might as well have to spend several percent more of its GDP on its own military forces to compensate, effectively paying the same amount on national security to suffer a major grand strategic defeat as it would have to pay to win. So if they hadn't got involved, they might have had to boost up their own military because it's more likely that they'd be more directly involved if they hadn't been kind of having this, in effect, proxy war in Ukraine. So interesting. So much more to say. Okay. This is in a section about fighting on through the winter and beyond, Russian escalation versus the search for peace. In short, they wanted to overrun all of Ukraine, Russia, and they lost. They didn't achieve those objectives. They failed to achieve their strategic objectives and are now failing to achieve their operational and tactical objectives. Again, this is back in November. Russia changed their war aims in March and beginning of April. Their war of choice then focused on the seizure of Donbass, Donetsk, and Luhansk oblasts. That was their operational objectives, and they failed there. Then they changed again and expanded to seize Zaporizhia and Kherson. The strategic reframing of their objectives or their illegal invasion have all failed. Every single one of them failed. And we've just witnessed last week Russia's retreat from Kherson. They retreated across the Dnipro River and they moved to a more defensible position south of the river. Their losses due to Ukrainian success and skill and bravery on the battlefield have been very, very significant. And that kind of trajectory has broadly continued, and we're waiting for a huge counteroffensive again. But that wouldn't have happened militarily, of course. Ukraine wouldn't be able to succeed without the help of the US. Ukrainians are not asking for anyone to fight for them. They don't want American soldiers or British or German or French or anybody else to fight for them. They will fight for themselves. All Ukraine is asking for is the means to fight, and we are determined to provide that means. Ukrainians will do this on their timeline, and until then, we will continue to support all the way for as long as it takes. And it's that kind of communication to Russia and China that they're in there that the Americans and everyone else are in for as long as it takes is super, super important. Because it is communicating to them that sense of unity, that sense of power, and it will have huge benefits. It's not just a case of, okay, we'll give a little bit more now, but we're not sure next time. If you very strongly say, yeah, we're in this for as long as it takes. You want to keep going, Russia? You keep going, mate. But you're in trouble because me and my mates here, we're in this for the long haul. So continuing aid, this is about controlling the future cost of aid, also should not be a partisan issue. Democrats need to accept the fact that some sacrifices will have to be made in civil spending to meet a vital US national security need, and that undermining such an effort is far too likely to create a world where the US ultimately has to pay more for security and make much larger sacrifices in civilian spending down the line. Republicans should also remember the value of bipartisan national security efforts since the end of World War II and the leadership of Eisenhower, Nixon, Ford, Reagan, Bush, and McCain playing in calling for such aid, as well as the nonpartisan security efforts of many key Republican leaders and members of the Senate and the House. The US does not exist in a world where it can export the burden of leadership or divide around some form of neo-isolationism. And this is where I point you to Perun's amazing video on NATO. And as it's entitled here, US Grand Strategy, NATO, Alliances, and Ukraine, How Alliances Underpin American Influence. What America is doing in spending this money is exporting security. This isn't, again, taking money from the US, throwing it at Ukraine and putting it in there. They are exporting, they're exporting literally pieces of hardware, but they are exporting security. Security is a service here. And they are willing to export this and pay a good deal for it, not in lies, but in terms of the cost of that. But they will reap the rewards of that. Security is an exchange, and you need to understand how the export of security works. Go and watch Perrin's video. It's super, super brilliant. Anyway, to return to where I was and just sort of coming to finish up, pursuing both the right kind of war and the right search for peace. Here he continues, in practical terms, this means the US may already be on the best course. Ukraine may have already won as much of an overall victory as it can. The best outcome for Ukraine does not seem to be to fight for this kind of total victory in recovering its lost territory that Zelensky initially called for, but rather to negotiate an end to the fighting and the growing level of damage to the Ukraine's economy, even if this does mean some Russian territorial gains, no Russian reparations, and no war crimes trials. Unfortunately, Putin may have no interest in such a peace until it is clear that Ukraine will continue to get US aid until such a settlement is reached, or until it is clear he cannot defeat Ukraine by destroying civilian targets or by trying to deploy more military force. There seems to be no current prospect Russia would agree to any broader withdrawal from the Ukrainian territory it seized in 2014 to any serious form of economic compensation or any meaningful war crime trials. There also seems to be little prospect that any real peace can be reached without the kind of compromises that Milley has suggested. At this time, continued US and other Western support must be convincing enough to convince Putin that any Ukrainian territorial concessions would have to be limited. A settlement could not weaken Ukraine's future capability to defend, and a settlement would have to have enough credibility as a lasting solution to creating a true peace rather than some pause in the fighting that Russia could exploit in the future. Right. Just to say what that is basically saying, and you don't have to agree with whether there will be any concessions by Ukraine, but the point here for me is that if the US and allies are going to say, like I was just talking about, if they're very clear on saying we are in this for the long haul and we are happy to pay aid, we're happy enough to pay for this aid and support Ukraine for as long as it takes, then that will pressure Russia into making more concessions themselves. Like if we suddenly, okay, we're only going to support till 2023, then Russia will continue, or to the end of 2024, whatever, Russia will continue fighting. And then when it gets to that point, we'll say, right, Ukraine, you're screwed now. We're going to have this, we're going to have this, and we're going to have this. Whereas if America puts its money where its mouth is, and everyone else, of course, then Russia are far less likely to be able to be in that position of power at the negotiation table. And just finally, the US must also fully accept the risk that it may well have to suddenly surge more aid depending on the course of the fighting and on the levels of escalation that develop in the months to come. In any case, the US must accept the fact that the cost of the US aid will remain high as long as the war continues and during the peace years of Ukraine's post-war recovery. But again, that money itself might also be stimulation. It might be a form of stimulation for US economy, and it might also pay dividends as well, not just in these kind of abstract ideas of national security, but in terms of US involvement in the reconstruction of Ukraine, so on. That soft power within Europe, people having more respect for the US, people doing trade deals, and so on and so forth. All these things that are connected to this kind of support and the cooperation, the strong cooperation between these nations. I mean, already we've got the AUKUS deal being sort of hurried along a bit quicker, or this cooperative work between the US, the UK, and Australia that is only going to be firmed up by the sorts of support the US is giving to Ukraine and the close work that they are doing with the US and with the UK and indeed perhaps Australia as well. The compensation for accepting this burden, however, will be that military and the economic burden placed on Russia will be far higher, and the risk to Putin of rejecting a real peace would be growing international hostility. The end result is that the flow of aid would remain a proxy war where the US continues to receive major strategic gains by weakening one of its two major threats and keep sending a clear message about US resolve to China. It would be a situation where Putin had turned the Russian effort to continue the war into even more of a self-inflicted wound. Indeed, it's this zero-sum game kind of approach where what we are putting in is Russia can't put that in. In fact, it's costing Russia to try and keep up with this aid and this support. And every time Russia is having to delve into its reserves, and each time the sanctions bite, then Russia becomes weaker and weaker and weaker. And this is to the benefit of the US geopolitical strategy going forward. Anyway, I hope that gives some kind of basis as to why I keep consistently saying this is money well spent from a US point of view, and indeed from all the allies, but this is obviously concentrating on the US particularly. That is my stream of consciousness. I mean, I'll highlight some of these, and actually some of the writing in there was a bit confusing, a few words that were not quite right, but you get the point. These are some well thought out pieces otherwise that I think allow us to understand that there is some really good rationale into why the US might seem to be spending this much money on supporting Ukraine. When and it's really important. Some of those stats, particularly about, well, actually, the money that's said is being spent this year is actually a quarter of that is being spent up to 2020. It's not even spent by the end of 2026. That changes how I think we evaluate the cost benefit analysis of the support for Ukraine. Anyway, that's me banging on. Sorry, it's imperfect and I'm tripping over words here and there, but and it's gone on for a very long time. I didn't have time to do any of my other stuff. I've got a whole backlog of extra pieces to talk about. Anyway, until next time, thank you so much and toodle pips.